Hi everyone, this is Dr. Johnson, and this lecture will be talking about metabolism. A lot of times in our society, people get really confused about metabolism because people automatically associate metabolism with burning calories. However, there's a lot more functions when we look at actual metabolism, and here are all the metabolic pathways that are present in our body at a given time. Depending on what we're doing, depending on when we last ate, depends on what type of metabolic pathways are running. And it's also important to note that there are simultaneously a couple different pathways that could potentially be turned on at the same time. When we look at the basics, we can look at metabolism as a pathway of converting food to energy. This powers everything that we do, from moving to thinking to growing, and also regenerating cells within our body. There are thousands of metabolic reactions that occur at the same time, and these processes are highly regulated depending on your current state, whether you're in a well-fed state or you're in a fasting state. So let's consider some factors that impact our metabolic rate. First and foremost, gender makes a huge impact whether you're male or female. Typically, males are going to have a higher metabolic rate than females. That's not always the case, but in general, we can make that generalization. Depending on what phase of the lifespan you are in also depends on how fast your metabolism is. For example, during infancy, that first year of life, you have the fastest metabolic rate of any time throughout the lifespan. And as we start to age, our metabolic rate slows. Physical activity. Physical activity is a way for us to increase our metabolic rate, therefore increasing the amount of calories that we can consume per day without gaining weight. And finally, the biggest modifiable factor of increasing our metabolic rate is muscle mass. The more muscle mass you have, the higher your metabolic rate is. Muscle is very metabolically active, therefore those who have more muscle mass have a higher and faster metabolism. The best way for us to increase our metabolic rate is not by drinking more lemon water, but rather by increasing the amount of muscle that our body has. So let's break down our entire daily energy needs. We can look at three different areas. The largest component is our basal metabolic rate, which is represented in that kind of bluish purple color. Basically, what this means is if you were to lay down in a bed for 24 hours and not move, how many calories would your body need in order to sustain life? This represents the majority of our metabolic rate. We can make a big impact by increasing our basal metabolic rate by increasing the amount of muscle mass that we have. Physical activity also plays a large role in our metabolic rate by providing us anywhere from 20 to 35% of our overall metabolism in a given day. Now, this can vary day to day depending on how active you are, or it can be a chronic if you're someone who's more sedentary or like an athlete who is more physically active daily. And then finally, the thermic effect of food. That only represents about 10% of our total metabolic rate. The thermic effect of food basically means how many calories does it take to actually process our food, breaking down the carbs, protein, and fat into the different nutrients like glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids, and then running those through the different metabolic pathways. This right here basically debunks any type of marketing system that food companies are sending to you saying that their product can increase your metabolic rate. Remember, the fastest way that we can increase our metabolic rate is by gaining more muscle mass. Here's an example that shows three different men and the amount of calories that they need per day. You can see here that the man number 3 requires very little calories, and that's because his weight is more from fat than muscle. Whereas man number 1 requires the most calories because he has the leanest body. So this again is going to show you that the more muscle mass you carry, the more calories you need throughout the day. So let's look at how do we actually take our carbs, protein, and fat and get that fancy little thing called ATP. Essentially, our bodies are factories that run very efficiently depending on what nutrients our body needs. So, our body takes this raw material, which is food in carbs, protein, and fat, and it generates power, or basically makes ATP. We also store for a rainy day. So, for example, on that Thanksgiving day, when you've eaten a lot of food and you're just sitting around pretty sedentary watching football, your body doesn't need a lot of that energy. But our bodies are very smart, and it's going to save all that energy as glycogen or store it as fat. And we also have the ability to discard byproducts. There are certain things that can build up as a toxicity in our body, and we have to get rid of it in order for our bodies to maintain its safety. For example, the nitrogen component of protein, if we do not process that into urea, that becomes toxic and it gets built up, and it makes our body do kind of funny things. So therefore, we can process it and discard it. All of this equals our metabolism. So metabolism goes far beyond just burning calories. So let's look at how we extract energy from our food. There are a lot of different pathways. So as you can see, the first part is digestion and absorption. We first have to break down these large macronutrients of protein, carbohydrates, and fat into the smallest unit, which are amino acids, glucose, and fatty acids. Once we absorb those into the bloodstream, they can get transported throughout the body. Then we have to enter the cell, and specifically the cytoplasm, in order to make an acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is the one commonality that all three macronutrients will break down to. This acetyl-CoA goes through that electron transport chain through the TCA cycle. Once we do that, then that's when we produce ATP and energy is generated from that cell. There are two different ways that we can classify metabolic pathways. The first is considered catabolic. Catabolic pathways take these large macronutrients and break them down into the smallest component. For example, carbohydrates into glucose. So if we were to look at that bread, we have to break down that carbohydrate into an individual glucose molecule. That glucose has to go through glycolysis and then it produces ATP. This is breaking down. Therefore, it's called a catabolic pathway. The opposite is called an anabolic pathway. Anabolic pathways are where we take these small components, we put a little bit of energy in, and we are able to make a large molecule. So we're building these complex molecules from very small components. An example here is when we store extra glucose as glycogen. Now remember, there are only two places that we store glycogen in the body. Does anybody remember where they are? Hopefully you said liver and skeletal muscle. Those two places are the only places that we can store glycogen. This is called an anabolic pathway. So what I want you to do is draw or write some type of an analogy to help you remember the difference between a catabolic pathway and an anabolic pathway.